Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Staley. And if you can believe it or not, we have only 2 more episodes before we finish all of our reading in Dostoyevsky, which it's about time. I mean, we've been reading him for quite a long time. It's about time to read some other stuff. But in order to finish strong, I have saved the best for last. And on today's episode, we're going to take Ivan Karamazov's objections to the existence of God head on. And if you've listened to the introduction, you know that Ivan takes a very strong problem of evil objection to God's existence, where he points at all of the evil and suffering and cruelty in the world, and he says, how could a good God possibly exist in light of the world that we see around us? But before we discuss it, I'd like to invite you to write a review of the podcast on iTunes or Facebook. Visit our website, wellreadchristian.com, or generally just look into Well-Read Christian. You might enjoy more of what you hear if you like this episode. And that's about it. I get so sick and annoyed of my own bit here, so I'll just go ahead and move on. One last thing before we get started is Ivan's argument against the existence of God basically rests on the idea that there is far too much evil to be able to definitively say that a good God could ever exist. He looks at the baseless cruelty and the suffering, and he uses it in his argument with Alyosha in a very vivid way. And what that means is that Dostoyevsky, and therefore I'm not going to sugarcoat it. He uses some pretty explicit material, so to speak, to describe how evil human beings are and how wretched the world can actually be. And so I guess I just want to let you know up front that this is not going to be hey, genocides, yada yada, here's how we respond to that. I'm going to try to treat the episode with a little bit of respect, and I'm going to treat the content matter with a little bit of respect. I do think that this is the most powerful argument against the existence of God or Christianity or whatever. And of course, I think that there are very satisfying answers to the questions. However, that does not mean that the episode is not going to feel a little bit like a tour of the Holocaust Museum. And I'd like it to feel a little heavier, or at least I'd like the section where we're talking about Ivan to feel a little bit heavier, because he has a good point, and we need to respect that and engage with that. And so therefore, the conversation will be a little bit heavier, and some of the things we talk about will be a little might make your stomach turn, is what I'm trying to get at. But you know, if you're the average person and you are in a decent mindset, I'm sure it'll be just fine. I'm not. The goal isn't to scare you out of your seat or something. But anyway, now that I've gotten the disclaimer out of the way, I guess one last thing I should say is that we're going to jump right in the middle into a conversation between Ivan and Alyosha. And if you don't know who either of those characters are, I would invite you to look at the introduction to Brothers Karamazov, which is earlier in the series, so that you might be able to have some context to the conversation that we're about to have. It might make the discussion more interesting, a little bit more impactful even. And so, here we go. So many characters in the Brothers Karamazov express some intense skepticism of Christianity. And in all of Dostoyevsky's novels, there are a lot of skeptics of Christianity. Smerdyakov, who's the true murderer in the story, simply dismisses Christianity as ridiculous. He cannot get around some alleged conundrums about faith, and he's the kind of atheist who likes to fold his arms and scrutinize Genesis 1 and then deem himself justified in his skepticism and drop the mic sort of thing. The who created God kind of drop the mic. And so Smerdyakov doesn't really take Christianity seriously at all, and perhaps it's hard to blame him, since he's an intellectual guy and the people around him really do not have an intellectual Christianity. His adopted father has a ham-handed Christianity. He believes it simply because that's the way he's been raised, and that's what he's always believed, and that's what's good and proper for a Russian to believe. And then everyone else, Smerdyakov is around, doesn't take Christianity seriously at all. And so basically, Smerdyakov is surrounded by idiot Christians and intelligent atheists. So it's not a real puzzle how he's going to turn out. But Ivan Karamazov is very different. Ivan Karamazov has a real argument against Christianity and the existence of God, a real problem with the way the world is, and so if God is behind it, then he's very angry. It's one of those God does not exist and I hate him kind of characters here. And so I want to set up the context and the character of this conversation. And first, I'd like to just give a little bit of a background on Ivan that I don't think I've said before. So Ivan is kind of a quiet guy until you get to know him. And the first sizable 100, 150, 200 pages of the book, the first quarter of the book, Ivan is kind of cast as a thoughtful guy who has a fixed gaze all the time. And it's as if he's concentrating on one thing and has been for his entire life. And he's not really interested in superficiality or joking around or partying or getting drunk or none of those things. He's a very sober, clear-minded kind of guy. And of course, through the conversation, he's willing to talk about his atheism. He's willing to engage with other people and talk about Christianity and religion and things. And of course, he's critical of it. But he doesn't really reveal his main chief thing. It's almost like he's got this secret argument or secret problem that he's trying to wrestle with in his own heart. And it's only in this conversation at this diner with Alyosha, with his brother, that he really talks about it openly. And you can even tell by the way that Dostoyevsky wrote the dialogue, which is so brilliant, that it's almost as if Ivan, is afraid of his own objection. So to set it up, Ivan is about ready to leave town, and he wants to meet with his brother with just them one-on-one, which has happened very rarely. And he wants to have a real conversation with him, just to get to know his brother kind of on a fundamental level before he leaves. And so they meet at this diner, bar, saloon, whatever you want to call it. And so they get together and they sit down, and first, of course, they start out talking about their circumstances. And as you'll recall from the introduction, there are 3 different love triangles in this book. And so, both these characters are wrapped up in them. And so they're talking about various things and the state that Dimitri is in and his feud with his father and those kinds of things. But eventually, of course, the conversation comes around to Christianity and religion, because Alyosha is a very pious man, and Ivan is obviously the exact opposite. And they've had some conflict over this, but they've really never been in a good spot to talk about it. And both of them want to. So it starts out where Alyosha says, "Okay, Ivan, so tell me, why do you not accept the world? I heard you say that the other night, kind of flippantly, and everyone was laughing and hooping and hollering, and so we didn't get into it. But I'm curious, what's your perspective? Why are you an atheist?" And Ivan says, "Well, of course, I'll tell you, but I'm not trying to corrupt you. I want you to know that I'm not trying to convert you to atheism." And he kind of pauses and he says, "Well, perhaps I'm even trying to be healed by you." And so Ivan then kind of pauses again, and he blankly begins talking about how most people, when they give to the poor, they're not actually doing it because they feel bad for the poor. They give to the poor for their own selfish reasons. They want to feel moral. They want to feel like they are the kind of person that gives to charity. They want their consciences to be soothed. You can kind of picture Ivan, he's playing with a salt shaker, or he's poking around at his food with a fork, and he's just kind of talking about how when people give to charity, he just realizes, or when they give to the poor, that he doesn't really believe that it's because they're good people fundamentally. He thinks that there's more selfish motives at the heart of it. And then he also goes on to say that if God actually has commanded us to love our neighbors, it would be impossible to genuinely do so, because once we're commanded to do it, then we have no choice to do it, except out of our own self-interest, and wanting to obey God or not wanting to be punished by him or whatever. And so it therefore becomes a selfish act once again, immediately, because there's no way that you could love one another or love your brother as yourself or whatever the case may be, because God has commanded you to do that. And so it removes the value of the moral action. And at this point, you might not be too interested in the conversation, just kind of some philosophical analysis of ethics or whatnot. But then Ivan says this, and I'll quote him directly. He says, quote, "I mean to talk about the suffering of mankind in general, but better let us dwell only on the suffering of children. That will reduce the scope of my argument about 10 times, but even so, it's better if we keep the children. The more unprofitable for me, of course. But first, one can love children, and even up close, even dirty or homely children. It seems to me, however, that children are never homely. Second, I will not speak of grown-ups, because apart from the fact that they are disgusting and do not deserve love, they also have retribution. They ate the apple and knew of good and evil, and became as gods. And still they go on eating it. But little children have not eaten anything, and are not yet guilty of anything. Do you love children, Alyosha? I know you love them, and you'll understand why I want to speak only of them now. If they too suffered terribly on earth, it is of course for their fathers. They are punished for their fathers who ate the apple. But that is reasoning from another world. For the human heart here on earth, it is incomprehensible. It is impossible that a blameless one should suffer for another, and such a blameless one." End quote. So first, Ivan objects to the idea of substitutionary atonement. How could one person suffer on behalf of another, and that be considered just or fair? How could that be the case? This is not human reasoning. Why, as the Christians say, does a child have to suffer because Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore all the world is corrupted, and so there's disease and famine and starvation and suffering, and children are brought into this world who did not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and yet they have to suffer for their father's actions and their ancestors' actions, and so there's this kind of objection to original sin that we see being played out. And then Ivan kind of goes on to talk about children in general. He says that everybody loves children because they're so innocent and beautiful. They're the best examples of what mankind has to offer. And he says that he once even knew a robber in prison who had killed an entire family while he robbed them. He even put knives to the throats of the children of that family and threatened them and scared them and that kind of thing. But then when he was in prison, he couldn't help but watch the children play in the prison yard. And at this point, Alyosha is a little confused. And it's totally understandable why that would be the case. I mean, Ivan has bounced from the ethics of what it means to love one's neighbor to a rejection of substitutionary atonement. And now he's talking about serial killers who also, can acknowledge that children are beautiful and they like little kids. It's almost as if Ivan doesn't want to talk about his real ideas. And so Alyosha says, Ivan, you look strange as you speak. It's as if you were slipping into madness. But Ivan interrupts him. He doesn't even let him finish. And he says, I heard something in Moscow recently. The Turks and the Circassians there in Bulgaria have been committing atrocities to the Slavs for fear of a general uprising. They burn and kill and rape women and children. They nail the ears of a prisoner to a fence and leave them there all night. And then in the morning they come back to hang them. And then Ivan interrupts himself and he says this. Listen to this, quote, "People sometimes speak of the animal cruelty of man, but that is terribly unjust and offensive to animals. No animal could ever be so cruel as a man, so artfully and artistically cruel. A tiger simply gnaws and tears. That is all he can do. It would never occur to him to nail people by their ears overnight, even if he were able to do it. These Turks, among other things, have also taken a delight in torturing children, starting with cutting them out of their mothers' wombs with a dagger, and ending with tossing nursing infants up in the air and catching them on their bayonets before their mother's eyes. The main delight comes from doing it before their mother's eyes. But here's a picture that I found very interesting. Imagine a nursing infant in the arms of its trembling mother, surrounded by Turks. They've thought of an amusing trick. They fondle the baby, they laugh in order to make it laugh, and they succeed. The baby laughs. At that moment, a Turk aims a pistol at it, 4 inches from its face. The baby laughs gleefully, reaches out its little hands to grab the pistol, and suddenly the artist pulls the trigger right in its face and shatters its little head. Artistic, isn't it? By the way, they say the Turks are very fond of sweets." End quote. So you can see that this dialogue is absolutely brilliant, because it's almost as if Ivan is afraid of his own argument. He's afraid of his own examples of how evil the human beings can be. He distances himself from what he's saying by, kind of distracting himself. He says, the Turks are very fond of sweets. And he brought up 4 other kind of tertiary points before even getting to the meat and potatoes of really what he wants to say. And Alyosha asks, what are you driving at, brother? And there's a long pause in the conversation. And Ivan says, I think that if the devil does not exist, and man has therefore created him, he has created him in his own image and likeness. You asked me what I was driving at, and I'll tell you. I have a collection of these little anecdotes and these little stories about how cruel human beings can really be. Now, some people collect stamps and other people collect coins. But me, I collect these stories. I cut them out of newspaper articles, keep them in a box. And I can go on and on. You see, man gets sensual pleasure with each strike while beating and inflicting pain. Animals, children, all the same. As long as someone is being beaten or pain is being inflicted, a man can find himself satisfied in it. Ivan describes a court case that was happening recently where there was a father who was on trial for beating his 7-year-old until she was out of tears with a birch. And he says that when he was acquitted of this charge, everyone roared and cheered because father should have the right to do what he wants. And it wasn't real, it wasn't all that bad. And he also describes a 5-year-old girl who had honorable and educated parents, but these parents beat their child, and they flogged her, and they kicked her, and they didn't even know why themselves. It was just part of what they did. And one night, she defecated in her room because she did not want to ask to go to the outhouse. And for that, they smeared the excrement in her face, and they made her eat it, and they locked her in the outhouse all night. And then they fell asleep to the sound of her moans and tears in the dark and the cold. And she froze, crying for God's help. Here's a quote. Quote, "Can you understand that a small creature who cannot even comprehend what is being done to her, in a vile place, in the dark and the cold, beats herself on her strained little chest with her tiny fist and weeps with her anguished, gentle, meek tears for dear God to protect her? Can you understand such nonsense, my friend and my brother, my godly and humble novice? Can you understand why this nonsense is needed and created? Without it, they say, man could not have even lived on earth, for he would not have known good and evil. Who wants to know this damned good and evil at such a price? The whole world of knowledge is not worth the tears of that little child to dear God." I'm not talking about the suffering of grown-ups. They ate the apple, and to hell with them. Let the devil take them all. But these little ones... He pauses again and says, I can see that you're being disturbed by these stories. I can stop. We can be done. But Alyosha says, no, I want to suffer. I want to hear you out. And so Ivan proceeds to offer anecdote after anecdote, story after story of cruel genocides, of cruel rapings, of burning people alive, of tortures, of cruelties, of children suffering. And I'll jump in again right here. And Ivan says, all right, I'll offer you one more anecdote. A haughty general who feels as if his service in the army has given him the power of life and death over his subjects, has since retired and has hundreds of war dogs as his pride and joy. And an 8-year-old boy was throwing rocks as he was playing, and he accidentally hit the paw of one of his general's favorite dogs. And the general noticed that the dog was limping later, and he asked about it, and he learns of the boy. And so he takes her from his mother, both are his peasants, presumably, and he locks him up. And the next day, in front of his mother, the boy is stripped naked, in front of the fully armored general on horseback, with all of his handlers, huntsmen and dogs and everyone else, and the boy is told to run as fast as he can, so that his dogs can be unleashed, and the hounds will chase the boy down and tear the boy to pieces in front of his mother. And that's exactly what happens. And so Ivan is getting worked up now, and he says, okay, Alyosha, then what should be done? Should we shoot the general? Should we shoot him? And Alyosha says, yes, shoot him, with a pale and soft and kind of a twisted, awkward smile. I mean, how else can you respond if you're in this conversation? And Ivan says, that is an absurdity. The world is built on absurdities. Because how could taking that general out back and hanging him, or shooting him in a lineup, or anything else ever make up for what just happened? How could doing anything to that general ever balance the scales, so to speak? And so Alyosha says, this is something that we call justice, but really it's just absurdity. And it's better to just not think about it. And then he says again, remember, Alyosha, I have narrowed my argument to only children. Obviously, this is a disadvantage to me, but I think it makes my point clearer. Adults and such, they earn their own suffering, but children, absolutely not. And at this point, I'd like to quote extensively, almost an entire page, and so bear with me, but I think you'll get caught up in it because it's a very, very powerful page. This page right here is worth reading the entire book, and I really mean it. And so I'm going to quote extensively because, again, I just think it's worth it. Ivan at this point says, quote, I am a bedbug, and I confess in all humility that I can understand nothing of why it's all arranged as it is. So people themselves are to blame. They were given paradise, they wanted freedom, and they stole fire from heaven, knowing that they would become unhappy. So why pity them? Oh, with my pathetic, earthly, Euclidean mind, I know only that there is suffering, that none are to blame, that all things follow simply and directly one from another, that everything flows and finds its level. But that is all Euclidean gibberish. Of course I know that, and of course I cannot consent to live by it. What do I care that none of them are to blame and that I know it? I need retribution. Otherwise I will destroy myself, and retribution not somewhere in some time in infinity, but here and now, on earth, so that I see it myself. I have believed, and I want to see for myself, and if I am dead by that time, let them resurrect me, because it will be too unfair if it all takes place without me. Is it possible that I've suffered so that I, together with my evil deeds and sufferings, should be manure for someone else's future harmony? I want to see with my own eye the hide lie down with the lion, and the murdered man rise up and embrace his murderer. I want to be there when everyone suddenly finds out what it was all for. All religions in the world are based on this desire, and I am a believer. But then there are the children, and what am I going to do with them? That is the question I cannot resolve. For the 100th time I repeat, there are a host of questions, but I have taken only the children, because here what I need to say is irrefutably clear. Listen, if everyone must suffer in order to buy eternal harmony with their suffering, pray tell me what have children got to do with it. It's quite incomprehensible why the children should have to suffer and why they should buy harmony with their own suffering. Why do they get thrown on the pile to manure someone's future harmony with themselves? I understand solidarity and sin among men, solidarity and retribution. I also understand. But what solidarity and sin do little children have? And if it really is true that they too are in solidarity with their fathers and all the fathers' evil doings, that truth certainly is not of this world and is incomprehensible to me. Some joker will say, perhaps, that in any case the child will grow up and have time enough to start to sin. But there's this boy who didn't grow up at all, but was torn apart by dogs at the age of 8. Oh, Alyosha, I'm not blaspheming. I do understand how the universe will tremble when all in heaven and under the earth merge in one voice of praise, and all that lives and has lived cries out, Just art thou, O Lord, for thy ways are revealed. Oh yes, when the mother and the torturer whose hounds tore her son to pieces embrace each other, and all three cry out with tears, Just art thou, O Lord, then of course the crown of knowledge will have come, and everything will be explained. But there is a hitch. That is what I cannot accept, and while I am on earth, I hasten to take my own measures. You see, Alyosha, it may well be that if I live in that moment, or I am brought back in order to see it again, I myself will perhaps cry out with all the rest, looking at the mother embracing her child's tormentor, Just art thou, O Lord. But I do not want to cry out with them. While there's still time, I hasten to defend myself against it, and therefore I absolutely renounce all higher harmony. It is not worth one little tear of even that one tormented child who beat her chest with her little fist and prayed to dear God in a stinking outhouse with her unredeemed tears. Not worth it, because her tears remained unredeemed. They must be redeemed, otherwise there can be no harmony. But how will you redeem them? Is it possible? Can they be redeemed by being avenged? But what do I care if they are avenged? What do I care if the tormentors are in hell? What hell can set this right? If these ones have already been tormented, And where is the harmony if there is hell? I want to forgive. I want to embrace. I don't want more suffering. And if the suffering of children goes to make up the sum of suffering needed to buy truth, then I assert beforehand that the whole of truth is not worth such a price. I do not, finally, want the mother to embrace the tormentor who let his dogs tear her son to pieces. She dare not forgive him. Let her forgive him for herself if she wants to. Let her forgive the tormentor her immeasurable maternal suffering, but she has no right to forgive the suffering of her child who was torn to pieces. She dare not forgive the tormentor, even if the child himself were to forgive him. And if that is so, if they dare not forgive, then where is the harmony? Is there a being in the whole world who could and would have the right to forgive? I don't want harmony. For love of mankind, I don't want it. I want to remain with unrequited suffering. I'd rather remain with my unrequited suffering and my unquenched indignation, even if I am wrong. Besides, they have put too high a price on harmony. We can't afford to pay so much for admission, and therefore I hasten to return my ticket, and it is my duty, if only as an honest man, to return it as far ahead of time as possible. Which is what I am doing. It's not that I don't accept God, Alyosha. I most respectfully return him his ticket. End quote. So Ivan says that justice is fundamentally impossible. The idea that someone could suffer on behalf of someone else is impossible. The idea that hell is ever going to make up for the fact that suffering exists is impossible. And he doesn't want the mother to forgive her child's murderer. She shouldn't. And killing the murderer isn't exactly justice, it's more suffering. And so how is harmony even possible in principle in the face of evil? How could evil ever be justified? How could hell ever justify the evil which is carried out on earth? And Alyosha has absolutely nothing to say in response to this. And so there's kind of a silence. And Ivan says, "Say, Alyosha, if you were the author of destiny, if you were God, and in order to make all of mankind happy for all eternity, you had to torture one little girl, would you do it?" And Alyosha softly says no. And then Ivan says, "And what of the people who are being happy for all time? Can they still be happy, knowing that their happiness is built on the unjust shedding of a tortured child's blood?" And Alyosha says no again. And so Alyosha, in the silence, brings up Christ, the God-man, who can forgive all and for all, because he gave his innocent blood for all and for everything, and it is on that foundation that the whole of destiny of man is built. I mean, after all, it's not like God just created the world and is watching, right? I mean, he went into it as a person, as Jesus, and he was betrayed and murdered and tortured himself. And it's on that basis which he found it just to create. And in response to this, Ivan brings up his poem, which is titled The Grand Inquisitor. And we talked about that extensively last week, and I do believe that it was a powerful episode. Ivan's rail against Jesus Christ, and how Dostoyevsky pictures that conversation going down is so incredible. Because Ivan basically says, just to summarize the last episode in a sentence, he basically says it's not fair that God set up Christianity to be so difficult. That God set up the world so that only a select few would ever find the self-discipline and the honor of following Jesus. Why did God have to make it so that in order to have harmony and eternal life, you have to follow these rules and be self-disciplined and choose to follow Christ? And none of that's fair. But that's just an episode for another time. Last week, in fact. Back to the topic at hand. I want you to notice something about Ivan Karamazov's arguments. I want you to notice that he has preemptively attacked the Christian rebuttal to the problem of evil. See, most Christians look at this argument, and we have three standard answers. Okay, the first one is the free will defense, where we say, well, if God hadn't created the way that he had, then we wouldn't know the difference between good and evil. And therefore, God gives each man and woman who's ever been born a choice, and he basically lets them live how they want to live and do the things that he wants to do. And so when there's a parent who is abusing a child, if God just intervened all the time, then there would be no free will. And so God is interested in protecting free will, and so he lets children be abused. And if you can't tell from my tone, I'm not really a fan of this argument. And Ivan is certainly not a fan of this argument, where he says, okay, really? That's your answer? This little girl has to freeze in an outhouse alone after being humiliated and abused by her parents so that you can know the difference between good and evil? I mean, it's even worse if you say, really? This 8-year-old boy had to be torn to pieces by dogs in front of his mother so that the general would have the privilege of free will? That's your argument? Because free will is so valuable? And then it doesn't really fix the problem, in my opinion. I'm going to go a step further, because I'm going to say what you would have to do to make that case is you'd have to argue that the moral freedom of evil agents is more valuable than the suffering of children is wrong. And I don't think that's going to be a very easy argument to make. I think the degree to which evil is done is worse than the degree to which human beings deserve or need free will. And if you're going to make that argument, go ahead. I do think that there's a respectable argument to make. I don't mean to trash it too much, but I don't think the argument is very persuasive or convincing. I wouldn't use it, and I think Ivan Karamazov demonstrates why that argument is weak. And the second canned argument that Christians have to say is that, well, God has a greater good in mind. And so when children are in outhouses after being abused and humiliated by their parents, it's for a reason. Or when there's a bunch of soldiers who decide to nail a man's ear to a fence and leave him there overnight, that's all part of God's plan, and God has a greater good in mind. To which Ivan says, yeah, what greater good could possibly come from that? And if millions of children have to suffer in order to have a greater good, then count me out. I don't want any part of this greater good, because this is evil. These Turkish soldiers committing one evil deed is not worth the price of whatever God would have in store for all eternity. And if you don't believe me, just think about it for 2 seconds. Because if you're in heaven and you know that you could only ever know how good heaven is because there were some people who did some evil things to a little girl, and if that somehow makes it all better, would you still be able to enjoy heaven knowing that it was based on that reality? And of course, Alyosha, for one, says, no, I would not be able to enjoy heaven knowing that. And then he says, okay, well, if you were God, would you be willing to create knowing that the cost of your creation is going to be the suffering of a little child who's calling out to you? And he says, no, again. And so I think that's a very good answer, so to speak, to the greater good theory, or at least a casual and canned response. And that's why I said at the beginning that this argument really does deserve some merit. And again, there are satisfying answers, right? And we're going to go through them. And I do think they're good answers. However, I am really not a fan of apologists who try to make light of this. And I'm not saying that I even know of any apologists who make light of this. But I'm just saying that if you're listening to this, then clearly you're interested in defending the Christian faith or understanding the Christian faith. And I would strongly discourage you from kind of having a ho-hum attitude towards this. I want to point out that the gospel, that Christianity, is literally an answer to the problem of evil. It is literally that God looks down on earth and sees the sin and the evil and the suffering and decides to take it on himself and to forgive and also arbitrate justice. And that's literally the gospel. And so this is not just another argument in the bag of the atheists that we have to destroy. It's not just another point to fit into our speeches and in our sermons. This is the point. This is the argument. This is the gospel. And so this argument really even goes farther and deeper than does God exist or is he good. This goes straight to the character of the gospel. Because even though Alyosha does not have the intellectual resources to argue against Ivan, his impulse is right. And that's to say that God is not an observer in these things. He is a partaker of these things. And if you're going to talk about innocent people suffering and how unjust that is, you have to recognize that the most innocent man who ever suffered was also the creator of that suffering. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm not going to answer the objections yet. I want to go through how Dostoyevsky answers the objections and then also how Alyosha answers these objections, and whether these intellectual conversations are even really the point. Sure, they could be useful or interesting or helpful or important if you're an intellectual, but I think that Dostoyevsky kind of covertly makes the case that, it's kind of beside the point. So I'll go ahead and move on. So those are the responses to Ivan's position. I forgot to mention the third one, actually. And the third one is there are many Christians who kind of just say, well, God works in mysterious ways, and we can't really know why God does the things that he does, and so we kind of just have to shut up and trust him. And actually, I think there's a lot of merit in that answer, but obviously it's not one that's going to go over very well with Ivan. He's not real thrilled about the idea that God would have the right to do that. And so if you kind of shrugged at a person like this and just said, hey, God works in mysterious ways, and just read the book of Job, we're not allowed to question him, then I think what Ivan would say is, after losing his cool a little bit, he'd say, okay, that's it. This so-called God is an absolute moral monster, and I respectfully return him my ticket. Truth is not worth the price. Goodness is not worth the trade. Good day, sir. So that's kind of Ivan's perspective, and you can appreciate that. I'm exhausted. So Alyosha's response. Alyosha has no response. Alyosha looks at all this, and he cannot make sense of it. He cannot address a single argument that Ivan has brought up, whether it is in the family of moral arguments or whether it was the arguments that he brought up before he even got to his main argument. Alyosha has nothing to say. He's been completely intellectually bested. However, he decides to live a pious life anyways. He does not abandon his faith in God. He says, these questions are too much for me. I do not understand it, and I could never understand it. But instead of rebelling against the order and being angry and spiteful, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust that God knows best and that his goodness is going to be triumphant. And that when we all cry, just art thou, O Lord, we can really mean it. And the way that ends up playing out in the story is that Alyosha ends up living a decent and livable life. He can live an intellectually consistent life based on faith. He can say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to trust God. And therefore, he has a foundation of right and wrong. He knows what justice is and where it came from. He knows that he needs to be virtuous, and he knows what virtue means and what it is, and he knows the stakes. But Ivan is lost because the conclusion of his argument is atheism. And so when Smerdyakov murders his father and Ivan benefits from it, he cannot bear the guilt. Because Ivan's reason, his arguments, say, hey man, lucky break. You just got 40,000 rubles, your idiot brother gets locked away, and you don't have to deal with the drama. And obviously, now your idiot father is also out of the picture. But even though Ivan's intellect and his atheistic presuppositions tell him to kick back and enjoy life because nothing matters and it's all absurd, he finds that he cannot live that way. And so it doesn't matter that Ivan has better arguments and that Alyosha can't respond to them. Because when push comes to shove, Alyosha lives a tragically optimistic life depending on God, and Ivan can't even justify his behavior. Because then, of course, he wants to make it right but he doesn't even have a definition of what right would look like. He wants to stand up in court and say, my brother is innocent and Smerdyakov is guilty. But he has no reason for doing that. Everything is permissible, right? It's just matter and motion. Why not just take your winnings and run? You got a lucky jackpot, man. And so when evil touches Alyosha's life personally, he's able to deal with it because he has a framework with which to conceptualize evil and good, and he's committed to fighting for the good and fighting with Christ and with God. And so he's able to overcome it. And so Alyosha triumphs over the existential questions while Ivan is driven insane because he recognizes that on his worldview, he can't even have an idea for what justice should look like. He can't even have an idea of what evil can look like, by the way. I'll go ahead and give you a little sneak peek into my response to Ivan's arguments. Ivan loses his mind because on Ivan's view, there is no such thing as evil. Ivan does the best job that I've ever read at pointing out the evils that human beings are capable of. But on Ivan's view, on atheism, there is no such thing as evil. There's just deeds and acts that you don't really like. Kind of like maybe you don't like broccoli, I don't like asparagus. You know, it's a little distasteful. And we've talked about this a lot in the podcast, especially in our series on Nietzsche, because Nietzsche recognized this fact. He recognized that without God, morality is an illusion, and therefore nothing is actually evil. But Ivan's argument is based on the premise that evil actually exists and should not exist. But that only makes sense if you have a definition of right and wrong. And having a definition of right and wrong only makes sense if there's a real distinction. Like a metaphysical distinction as a feature of the universe, just like gravity is a feature of the universe, or existence is a feature of the universe. Well, you know what else is a feature of the universe? Right and wrong. Well, how can you get that? Well, you have to have a higher power. It can't be votes. It can't be just your little internal emotions that happen when you hear a story. That's not good enough for right and wrong. That's good enough to describe your feelings. But if you want a real right and wrong, that's actually going to be the premise of an objection about whether God exists or not, then you better have a real right and wrong. And it turns out that to have a real right and wrong, you need a real God too. So anyway, because of that fundamental contradiction in Ivan's viewpoint, his worldview becomes unlivable and he goes absolutely insane. But Alyosha, even though he cannot answer the arguments, can live, I don't want to say peacefully because he also endures some pretty tough stuff. He can live consistently and he can live, I want to say happily, but I don't want to use that word too gently because it's definitely a tragic and sober view of what life is really like. And so anyway, that is Alyosha's answer to the problem of evil. That is Alyosha's answer to Ivan. He says, look, I cannot answer you, but I'm not going to abandon my faith. And it's his faith that's going to end up being more intellectually consistent as evidenced by the way the characters live their lives. Because Ivan realizes that to live as opposed to the good, to live in a topsy-turvy world where there's really no such thing as right or wrong at all, and also I hate God because he's evil, that it doesn't make sense. But that's actually not quite how Dostoyevsky actually answers Ivan. I do think that that's a deeper answer that he gives, and it's a very profound one. We'll talk about it more next week because as some rough stuff hits Alyosha, it's cashed out. But in Dostoyevsky's equation, in order to answer Ivan Karamazov's arguments, he actually does it in an artistic way. We see this in a letter that he wrote. He says he didn't answer Ivan point for point. He decided to answer him in a beautiful way, in an artistic way, in a way that has really resonated with people ever since. And so the way he does this is he writes this entire character, Zosima, who is Elder Zosima, and he's the one under which Alyosha studies. And like I said, true to Dostoyevskyan form, Dostoyevsky uses kind of this whole character as a response to Ivan. So rather than point by point, he uses an entire narrative to answer him. And so that leaves a huge challenge for someone like me. How do I summarize that for you? Well, I can't. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to say one sentence and then tell you the story and see if you're persuaded, see if you like Dostoyevsky's answer through Zozima. So basically what this character illustrates, in my opinion anyway, is that, or what Dostoyevsky is trying to communicate, is that the nature of being, the nature of the universe is not inherently evil. It's human beings who corrupt it. And of course, you might shrug and be like, well, okay, that's not exactly new or profound. But what Dostoyevsky is saying through Zozima is that the universe is an expression of God's goodness, and that is answer enough. Every evil, every instance of evil that Ivan cites was committed by a human being. But have you ever paused and looked at the world as it is without human beings? Or without the corruption of human beings, I should say. And so, let me tell you the story. So, Zozima is this man. He didn't start out a man. He was born in a small Christian family with a humble Christian mother. And they had servants and things. And so, Zozima's older brother died when he was 17. And this 17-year-old older brother was persuaded to atheism by an intellectual who was a mentor in this boy's life. And then he gets sick. And the doctor says that you're going to die. And as the days drag on while he is ill, it seems to this atheistic 16-year-old boy as though he's having an awakening. And as he's dying, he humbles himself. And he realizes that he is beyond fortunate to have a family who loves him and weeps for him every day that he's sick and dying. And he's flabbergasted that he has servants who do things for him. And he is appalled how he used to insist that the candle not be lit in order to illuminate the icon, or that, he used to get angry when his family would pray or read the Bible. And now he's realizing, why? Why would I do that? Why would I get upset by that? He's tendered by the realization that he's going to die. And he becomes more loving and more thankful. And there's this one day where the doctor comes in and he says, hey, am I going to live one more day on this earth? And the doctor says that actually, you're doing much better. You'll last a few more years, perhaps. And the boy responds by saying, well, what are months and years? Why count days when you can experience all of happiness in a single day? He then goes on to ask, why do we remember quarrels? Or why do we boast or keep track of offenses? He asks, why don't we go to the garden and walk and play and love and praise and kiss and bless life? Because life is good, and it only takes sickness in order to see that. And once I know that I'm going to die in a few years, suddenly I see all that I'm ungrateful for. And the doctor says, but not while he's listening, he says, he's going mad from the illness. But he himself is weeping over the birds. And he says, I have sinned against you, birds, because the glory of God shows in you and in the trees and in the meadows and in the sky, and I alone live in shame and dishonor, not worthy of anything. Because I live in this world that God has created, and I do not see the beauty and the glory every single day. Instead, I'm too busy being ungrateful and swearing up a storm and being angry and bitter. And it has taken an illness to make me realize that we live in paradise already. And it's we who corrupt it. And so one morning, before anyone woke up, Zozima goes into his brother's room. He's beckoned over, and the brother who's dying looks deeply into Zozima's eyes and clasps his shoulders with a tender, loving face. And he simply looks into it for a minute. And then he says, go, play, live for me. And so the boy runs away and obeys, and he plays, and he is a beautiful and it's a beautiful and wondrous moment that was not understood by the boy until years later, and then it stuck with Zozima all of his life. The boy, grows up even after his brother dies, and there's this scene from church that he remembers vividly of the pastor talking about Job and how God took everything from Job and Job never found out why. And then later, when Job was faithful, God restores even more sons and daughters and another wife and even more wealth than he could have ever had. And Zosimus says that he remembers scoffers saying, well, how could God ever hand over, Job for no good reason? And how could Job ever truly love his new family without just being completely ruined by losing his first family? And Zosimus later reflects on this, and he says, quote, but it is possible. The old grief, by a great mystery of human life, gradually passes into quiet, tender joy. Instead of young, jubilant blood comes a mild, serene old age. I bless the sun's rising each day, and my heart sings to it as before, but now I love its setting even more. Its long and slanting rays, and with them quiet, mild, tender memories, dear images from the whole of a long, blessed life. And over all is God's truth, moving, reconciling, all forgiving, end quote. And so Zosima is this character who Dostoyevsky uses to represent the perspective that life is still good. Life is still good. And there's a duel that happens early in Zosima's life. He kind of becomes a carousing officer after he's grown up, and but when he decides to go into the monastery is where he gets into this fight with this other man. They're both kind of jealous of this girl, and eventually there's a slight of honor, and they declare a duel. And so that day, Zosima, or I should say that night, Zosima can't sleep. And he's realizing, am I really going to kill a man for this? Am I really going to die for this? And it just so happens that when he got home from work, he had a servant who he got really mad at, and he struck him across the face. And he just woke up very early in the morning realizing, like, why did I smack that guy? That is not cool. He is the same. He's made of the same things as I am. He has the same dignity and image before God as I do. And he just realizes that this is ridiculous. Why would I kill this man? And I cannot believe that I've been so blind and ungrateful and evil as to strike a servant. And why is he my servant anyway? I should treat him in the same way that he treats me. And so what he does is he goes to this duel and he lets his opponent take his first shot. And then after it grazes his ear, he takes his pistol and fires it into the air. And then he declares kind of his thoughts. And then he ends up going into the monastery and he says, this is ridiculous. Like, why is our life so filled with all of these little things, these little offenses? We're so ungrateful. And because we live in this world where each of us are communally guilty, we are all in this together. Because all of us accept this life, this existence, without pushing each other or pushing ourselves to do any better or think any higher or be any better. And so Dostoyevsky, through this picture of Zosima, seems to be saying two things. The first is that life is so incredibly good and so subtly powerful that the undercurrents of beauty can justify the admittedly flashy stories of evil. Even though the stories of evil can be jarring, the nature of the universe itself, the nature of being, is an expression of God's goodness, and that itself can be an answer. And so finally, Zosima's turning point and the axiom which changes Zosima's mind, and I think works as kind of the linchpin for Zosima's argument, is secondly to say, now wait a minute, every instance of evil that you can think of has to do with a human committing an atrocity against another human being. And maybe you better check yourself before you go out there and criticize the world. You know, it's easy to talk about the evils of a Turkish soldier, but what about your own heart? I mean, what separates you from a Turkish soldier? You are both human beings. You're the same thing, capable of the same evils, and the only difference between you and him is circumstance. And so you need to remember that when you look at God's creation, you are the thing that is cursed. You are the thing that is wrong with the world, because you are not what you could be. You are ungrateful and ignorant and blind and spiteful and vengeful and angry and lustful and prideful and all the rest. And meanwhile, God's bees are humming, and his grass is growing, and the horses are grazing, and the trees are blowing, and the sunsets are falling, and the sunrises are ascending, and the fish are splashing in the rain. And God says it is good. Zosima also recalls a story where he was walking along the river at night with some fishermen, and there was this 18-year-old homely boy who was passing through, and they just enjoyed the bright, still warm July night by the river, and the fish were splashing in the river, and there was a refreshing mist that arose, and they were just talking. And they just, two total strangers, talking about basically the beauty of God's world. They were talking about the forest and the river, and it's a mystery, and marveling at each blade of grass, every bug, every ant, every golden bee. All of it is a testimony to the miracle of life and of existence. And so these two characters, this 18-year-old kid and Zosima, they discuss kind of the meekness and the beauty of horses and oxen, who are man's companions and workers. And it turns out the boy really loves the forest, and he knows the birds very well, and he can lure any bird and catch them and play with them and then let them go. And so the two of them kind of fall asleep there together, laying on the grass, talking about this, and they really understand the beauty of God's creation. And so Zosima's life and Dostoyevsky's response to Ivan's problem of evil is basically, number one, life can be cruel, but it is also undeniably good. And even though tragedy is real, God is justified in creating good things despite the evil in the world. The life of Elder Zosima demonstrates that a life of happiness achieved by living honestly and piously is a good thing. And life as God intended it, and the life that God offers us through Jesus Christ, is one that is fundamentally good. And so we can have this sober optimism about reality. And even if our entire family gets wiped out in one day and all of our wealth is destroyed and our houses collapse, we can say with Job, I didn't bring anything into the world. I'm not going to take anything out of the world. God gives and God takes away. Blessed is the name of the Lord. And of course, the other lesson that Zosima brings to the table is to say, hey now, don't get on your high horse and look around as if you are some arbiter of moral justice. You are the reason that God is coming back with wrath. You and everyone else. And me. So watch yourself, because you are the very reason that this world is corrupt. We are all guilty together. I need to recognize that. So in response to Zosima, though, in response to kind of the kumbaya, everyone, all of nature singing happily, you can just tell what Ivan's response would be, right? You can just tell he'd be like, well, I can criticize that. Well, your perspective is still a perspective, and here I go. I'll take a baseball bat to that. Well, look at this, look at that. How come this happened? This is ridiculous. And I think Zosima's response will be, well, go ahead. Same with Dostoyevsky. He'd be like, look, it's not an argument. All right, this is a way of life. Go ahead, criticize it. Dostoyevsky doesn't even offer an argument. He offers a picture. And Zosima and the Christian life of seeing the beauty of God and deciding to affirm God's statement, it is good, it's not a rebuttal. So go ahead, make your critique. We'll be over here. And at some point, you're just a termite. You're just, you're not doing anything constructive. So go ahead, Ivan. Go ahead. Rage against God. Be angry. Do it. See where it gets you. We'll be over here, having a sober and honest look at the world, and we'll take a deep breath, and we'll say, I trust God. Because there's a time when the arguments are beside the point. Life is yours to live, and if you humble yourself, then you will see the beauty that God has created, and you can be joyful despite the pain, and despite the tragedy, and despite the malevolence, just like Job. And there are some critics of Dostoyevsky who have pointed out that this argument that Dostoyevsky makes in his book really just resonates with people who already believe in Christianity. It's not really that great of an argument against Ivan because it is kind of just pandering to people who are already Christians. People who are already Christians generally read Dostoyevsky and are very impressed by this argument. However, people who are not Christians don't view it the same way. And I think it's because, well, if you're a Christian, then hopefully, especially if you're a thoughtful Christian, then you've already thought about this. And you've already looked into the world, even if it's subconscious, and you've seen that life is good, and that God is good, and that the world that God created, it is cursed, man. It is cursed. But behind it all, you can see the goodness of God, and you're not going to turn your back on that. You're going to believe in that. You're going to cling to that. You're going to strive for that. You're going to try to cultivate that. You're not going to curse it and smash it and say, why, oh, why is life so terrible? You're going to say, no, life can be terrible. It can be, but it doesn't always have to be. There's a difference between tragedy and catastrophe. And I believe that tragedy is when bad things happen to you, and catastrophe is when you let bad things completely unravel who you could be and who you are. And so finally, I'd like to come to my responses to Ivan Karamazov. And I do think that Dostoyevsky's arguments are very, very powerful. However, I do think there's also a place for responding to Ivan Karamazov with kind of a bookish, intelligent argument. And instead of this artistic picture, I do think there's a place for saying, all right, Ivan, you really want to claim that you have the intellectual high ground? Well, let's go to bat then. And unfortunately, I've kind of run my course here in this episode, and an extensive treatment of the intellectual problem of evil we'll probably have to go into another place. I've kind of discussed the existential problem of evil and a potential answer to that. So just a few thoughts on the moral problem of evil, and that is, one, I do think that there's an appropriate element of speechlessness before God in this manner. And that's, of course, the lesson of Job. The lesson of Job is that God is ultimately the definition of right and wrong. And if you think that just because that you have some owies and that some people who are close to you died, that you have the right to question God, you have another thing coming. Because at the end of the day, God is good, whether you think so or not. And again, you're kind of left with that. That's really all you can say. And if you're an atheist and you go, well, I'm going to criticize that, it's like, okay, go ahead. We're still stuck in the same world. And another thing is, all right, fine, you want to criticize me? Well, I'll turn around and criticize you right back, because atheism is not off the hook for the problem of evil. All right? We all live in the same world, we look at the same problems, and we have to make sense of it. How can you make sense of the evil in the world? Well, on atheism, as we've already talked about a little bit, there's no such thing as evil. There is just things that you don't like. And so on Ivan's atheism, he can't actually look at a little girl suffering and say, that's evil. He can only describe kind of the brain states. He can describe the atoms and the molecules, but there's no higher power. He can't even say there's a soul, that there's a real person, that this girl is actually experiencing this pain. He can't say any of that. He can't say there's right and wrong. He can only say there's a overgrown ape that is wailing and moaning, and now that it's dead, it's over, it's done, it's gone. But on our view, we do have a definition of right and wrong, and we have a hope that all wrongs will be righted. On the atheistic worldview, There's no such thing as right and wrong, and everything is exactly the way it is, and there's no such thing as justice, and everything that dies, that is the end. So Hitler died, same end as Mother Teresa, or, pick your favorite saint, pick your favorite sinner. There's no ultimate difference. And so once you recognize that atheism isn't exactly off the hook for the problem of evil, you realize there are two perspectives, really. There's the Christian perspective that makes sense of right, that makes sense of wrong, that makes sense of good, that makes sense of evil, and then tries to live in accordance with the good. And then there's atheism, which just rejects the entire thing and is angry and spiteful and wants to throw rocks at God, but needs the definition of rock in order to pick it up in the first place and try to huck it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't get very far. I've also mentioned that I'm not a huge fan of the free will argument. I do think there are ways that you can construct the argument to be intellectually sound. I just don't find it existentially sound. And so it's not one that I think is really important, because the problem of evil is an intricate interweaving between intellectual and existential considerations. And so I just find that the free will argument, I have a tough time with it. I just don't see how the value of a human being's free choice could outweigh the evil in the world. However, again, that depends that evil in the world actually exists, which depends that God exists, which depends on the fact that God exists. And I think the greater good argument is actually very powerful, very, very powerful. I think it's the final word, because it actually puts the burden of proof back on the atheism, where an atheist has to demonstrate that there's no possible way that a greater good could come from evil. And if evil exists, you basically have to make a statement like Ivan did, which is to say that if evil exists, then there's no such thing that in redemption. There's no such thing as retribution. That as soon as there's evil, you could never make up for it. And I think that's actually a really hard place to be at. I do think that it's possible that evil things occur and that the person who is the victim can rise up and forgive, and that it can end up being a good thing in the end. And it's not in our position to see all of the good things that come from the evil that occurs. However, there is a good God who's behind it all, and who guarantees that the end will be worth it for those who believe and trust and love and follow him. And so, like I was trying to say earlier, it actually puts the burden of proof back on the atheists, because they have to demonstrate that that's not even possible in principle. And they really cannot do that. And if you look at the problem of evil logically, premise one, if an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God existed, then there would be no evil in the world. It turns out that formula is actually really, really hard to prove. I mean, how could you even prove that in principle? It just turns out that the premises do not lead to the conclusion that they need. And so Ivan's position ends up being less rational and less emotionally compelling. Even though it's flashy and it's showy and it makes us sad when we think about, it turns out that the alternative to Ivan's position is more rational and more emotionally satisfying, while Ivan's position doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense when you look at the details, and is actually emotionally revolting, because when you look at the details, you realize, wait a second, Ivan, your position says that a little girl, humiliated and alone, freezing to death in an outhouse, is just chemical reactions. It's chemical reactions in a brain. And as soon as it expires, it's over. It's done. The tissue is now decaying. That's it. But on a Christian perspective, we can say, no, there's a human being in there. There's a soul in there. Ivan has no idea what a human being is or what a soul could possibly be. You definitely can't ground it. And so, even though Ivan's arguments are big and they're flashy, and they're showy, and they're heartfelt, I don't think the logical or the existentially satisfying step is atheism. I think atheism ends up getting you in worse places. And so at the end of the day, the picture that Dostoyevsky paints to the life of Zosima ends up being very, very powerful. Because yes, life is hard and there's real and there's deep tragedy. But the Christian worldview, the true worldview, gives us the resources necessary to deal with it. To say, I can become a better person from this. And God is justified in bringing me this suffering and bringing the world this suffering because he is good and he has good plans in store. Thank you for listening to the Well-Worded Christian Podcast. Please tune in next week for what is essentially going to be part 2 as Alyosha's ideas are tested against the circumstantial problem of evil. Will be next week. So today we looked at the moral problem of evil, and next week we're going to look at the circumstantial problem of evil. God, why is there death? Why are there hurricanes? Why this kind of a thing? And I think it'll be just as impactful, just as interesting, just as important for sure. Anyway, thank you for listening to the Well-Worded Christian Podcast, and hopefully you'll join me next time.